Hello friends, I am Nikita. I am a national instructor and a chess trainer. Welcome to our YouTube channel Chess Kaksha. In today's video, we will discuss about isolated pawns. So let's see what are isolated pawns. This is the example of an isolated pawn. An isolated pawn is created when no other friendly pawn is on adjacent file. The lonely pawn can't be defended by any of its brothers, and as a result, it becomes vulnerable to attack by enemy pieces. In this position, white and black both have 3 pawn islands. Black's e6 pawn is an isolated pawn. You can see there are no black pawns on the d file or on the f file. If any white piece attacked this black e6 pawn, black would have to defend the isolated pawn with a piece because there are no pawns to do this job. Similarly, white d4 pawn is the isolated pawn. Let's take another example of isolated pawn. Many players feel that an isolated pawn is always a weakness, but it's not true. In this position, the isolated pawn on d6 is a valuable passer. So, here an isolated pawn becomes a strength for white. As you can see on the board, the isolated pawn is guarded by the queen and rook behind it. Let's take another example. If your isolated pawn are centrally placed, it may guard important central squares. As you can see in this position, the isolated pawn on d4 is centrally placed and controlling the important c5 and e5 squares. How you can use your isolated pawn for an advantage? In this example, black's pawn on a5 is an isolated pawn, while white has connected pawns on a2 and b3 squares. But if black trades its isolated pawn by moving a4, now black can get rid of its isolated pawn and turns white healthy pawn majority into weak isolated pawn. If your opponent have isolated pawn, so what you should do? How you can take advantage if your opponent have an isolated pawn. As we know, the square in front of the isolated pawn can't be guarded by one of its neighbor brothers. Due to this, that square is a perfect home for an enemy piece. In this position, white's control over the d4 stop the isolated d pawn and thus gives white knight a very good home. So now the black's isolated pawn is stuck on one place and hence will be easy to attack. Now let's take another example. In this position, white has done good things as he has taken control of the square in front of the pawn. Second thing, he has exchanged all the minor pieces. Now, white wins this isolated pawn by e4 as the pawn on the d5 can't take pawn on e5 because it is pinned. In this way, you can take advantage of isolated opponent's pawn. So these are all about isolated pawn. I hope you like this video. So please like, share and subscribe. Thank you.